It is a privilege for me to be presenting at this year's Online Auditor Expo. My intention of this presentation is to help auditors understand why a company would outsource their manufacturing or service or business processes. What business strategies and considerations would drive that decision? And knowing this will help auditors plan a more effective audit. So moving on to objectives, I hope once you understand the business strategies, you will increase the usefulness of audit tools like checklists, agenda, and more. Better audit planning will help auditors conduct an audit that is more than just for compliance, but also for improving performance of the supplier and the supplier relationship. So let's start with why. Why would a company outsource? Well, the first that comes to play is leveraging core competencies. It's possible that your business has a core competence, has been performing this work inside, but it's not really a core competency, and they're not competitive in that process or that work. So investing in that to make sure that they are competitive would be too costly maybe to keep that up. So that's a reason why they would outsource, because there are many suppliers out there that are probably very competitive at that. So looking at that total cost picture might be the reason that you would outsource. But also optimizing inventory management. When you outsource a lot of box builds, the suppliers can manage that inventory for you. One of the biggest considerations is geographic advantages. Companies want to be as close to the customer base as economically feasible, or at minimum close to the supply chain as economically feasible. But there are other geographic desirables, and that is there are countries that if you want to sell your product in that country, you actually need to do business within that country. So that would be a reason for you to outsource. Flexible labor. If your demand is seasonal or it's too flexible, you got highs and lows, that means that your labor force is either sitting there doing nothing or you're laying off or rehiring. And that becomes a pretty big burden on a company for a cost perspective and employee satisfaction and learning curve, because your employees are then not as trained as they should be. The last on this list is the IP or intellectual property protection. And you notice the question mark, because there are risks of sharing your IP. And if you are very sensitive about that, or it's too compromising for you to do that, then you might not end up outsourcing. Or at minimum, you might want to look at how can you best put yourself in a good position on picking the right partner to work with when you're looking for that third-party supplier. These strategic factors that have driven a business decision to outsource their process, whether it be a box build or repair services or more, once that decision is made, there are many considerations to examine to have a successful supplier relationship. And on this slide, we're looking at what those considerations might be. It could be leadership, ownership, specifications, looking at all the procedures in the process, looking at financial management, business continuity, financial records, communication, inventory management, continuous improvement, and service. So let's start on the next slide with leadership. You're looking for a supplier that has the third-party supplier that you're looking for the leadership that is engaged with their board of directors and their senior management in setting strategies and vision for their company. And you're looking to see, is this vision and processes having a strong focus on the customer as an advocate? Does local leadership have a focus on monitoring and developing their staff to provide the competencies needed to meet the strategies of that supplier? Do they promote risk-based thinking and fact-based thinking as part of their corporate and local culture of quality? Does the leadership demonstrate that that they protect their reputation as well as all their customers' reputations. Looking at the next consideration would be ownership. And this one is probably one of the most critical to be settled or examined through the outsourcing process. And that's looking at, well, who owns the design? Are you going to transfer ownership of the design? Probably not outsource anymore. That would be selling your product. So if you own the design, what elements within the process do you own as well, or the tools and the fixtures and the test equipment? What is the risk, again, of sharing this information? Some companies outsource the box build, but they keep some small assemblies internal and feed them to that third-party supplier because it's too critical for them to let that process step out. Who's authorized to make changes on any of the tooling or any of the fixtures or any of the software in the test equipment? What about making changes to the process? What about who owns the calibration of all the test fixtures and all the measuring equipment? If you've designed the functional test equipment, are you the one that's going to calibrate that equipment, or are you going to give procedures to the supplier so that they are doing the calibration on a routine basis? You've given a lot of assets to the supplier in the test equipment, molds, any of the tooling. How is the supplier going to identify those assets so that it's visible that this equipment and tooling belongs to you? And how is that cataloged? Are they inventoried? How frequently are they inventoried? Those are assets that show on your financial books, and so you need to be able to keep track of those assets. You might have the supplier purchase test equipment or molds for you. You've paid for it. What's the process for them to give you the financials on that and the receipts so that you can probably have your finance department depreciating them on the frequency that they need? The contract of suppliers must state that you, as the customer, have authority for access to auditing and seeing the records when you transfer this process to them. So the next consideration is specifications. And these specifications could be for finished products, for subassemblies, for components. They're all of the procedures and the process steps for assembling a product or for executing a business process. There are critical sequences and functional tests and labeling that need to be considered, and they're called specifications. Specifications for taking a product apart. Once it's assembled, sometimes those sub-assemblies can't be necessarily taken apart. So when you break a seal on a unit, it needs to be put back together in a certain way, and then there needs to be further types of tests. So when you're doing specifications for outsourcing a box build, you need to look at both of those types of specs. And what is the decision criteria for proposing changes on any specifications? Is it a cost versus benefit analysis? Is it a risk versus benefit? And what about validation costs? Do you want your suppliers to do all that work for you and then pass it by you? Or do you want to make sure that you have the right technical people internal to you that are collaborating with the supplier to ensure that that product design and functionality is not compromised by any of the changes that the supplier wants to do? And who has authorization to make the decision to implement the change? Because once you've validated, there's a lot of steps involved to actually implement a change. First, you have to change the actual specifications and tooling, test equipment. You might have material that needs to be bought, and you need to disposition any of the product in between, as well as you might want to have traceability as to what serial numbers or batch numbers or some way of knowing when was the change implemented so that the product shipped to customers, you would know if there was a customer complaint that it already had that change in it or not. So the next consideration is financial management. Financial management is a big area, but we're talking about covering everything from pricing of inventory, any markups, any stocking or restocking charges, any tax strategies for products in different countries. Each country has their own tax group, so it's important to make sure, or tax laws, it's important to make sure that you're looking at each of those if you're going to be having product cross borders or manufactured in one location but sold in a different country. And how does another financial is, how does the supplier keep competitive in the marketplace? What do they do to make sure that they're being competitive? And how do you compare them in the future? But it also includes things like billing cycles, payment terms, what currency you're using, and much more. All of this gets discussed during the assessing of the supplier in the selection phase. But it also gets documented in either the contract or procedures, and then verified along the way to ensure compliance and effectiveness. And this is one of those areas that you ask the question about, well, who does the auditing of this? Is this your quality auditor that does this, or is this a financial auditor that does this? Again, all of that needs to be considered when you're outsourcing. The next consideration is business continuity, sometimes called risk management or resilience. And business continuity, you're really looking at ensuring that the supplier can sustain their own business and their supply chain. You want to verify that that supplier has a plan in place, but also that they've tested that plan. If they have a recovery model, because if something happens and there's a flood or something and they need to pick up and move, do they have a plan that includes everything down to fixtures and equipment and tools and facilities and resources as far as the technical staff to be able to do that job? But there's also things from a risk management perspective on compliance to any and all regulations, laws, both locally and internationally, for the type of product or process that this supplier, you're asking the supplier to do. And is that you that monitors that? What's the plan that they have that they're being compliant to that? Another question is, of course, is the financial health of the business to handle any event. So when you originally select a supplier, hopefully you've done a due diligence to look at the financial health of their business. But when you're looking at risk management and business continuity, you also want to make sure that they have the financials to handle any adverse events. So basically, do they have insurance? Do they have liability insurance too for any defects? And what's your business requirement? Because you're the one that's going to get the financial impact, not just them. And you have to be concerned whether they cover all their customer base, because if one of their customers sues them for something, that could cut your business right out. And how long would that give you to come back in? These are all under financial. Do they have available resources, staff, and funding to meet the technical and business requirements, not only for your needs, but for their other customers? Do they have succession planning for their key staff? Again, these are all business continuity type things. If it's a family-owned business and there's no successor for the next in line in the family, do they have plans in place as to who would take over the business? How old are the owners if it's family run, so that you know the longevity of the business? Do they have contracts with their suppliers? I mean, how do they protect the supply chain that they rely on? And contracts are one thing to put in place, but are they verified once in a while? Do they go out and monitor their suppliers or audit their suppliers to ensure that they're doing good business? The next area under risk management and business continuity is the IT system. And there are so many things to ensure are in place under this category. I'll give you some to think about. The first is, what's the current version of their IT system? Meaning the provider of that system or that IT system, are they current? Are they still supporting the version that this supplier has live? And when was the last time it was upgraded to their system? And what are the security access controls? Are they two-level security access? What about somebody for new employees? How do they shield each employee to just the functions that they need for that job? Versus if they move jobs, do they then have access to two places? What controls are in place for that? What was the validation process for when the system went live and for any changes that are made in the system? What are backup procedures and how often is the system backed up? And where are the backups stored? We talked about business continuity, and one of the things around business continuity for the IT system is that how long would it take them to download a backup and resume operations from either their existing site or from a resurrected site with a new actual hardware. And then if the system goes down, how long will it take them to do that? Because do they have a process in place to document it, maybe manual, so that you can continue to run the business and they can continue to build product for you or execute a process? And if they don't, then that basically tells you if it takes them 60 days to get up and running, you have no product for 60 days. This basically just scratches the surface for IT from a risk management and business perspective. And again, all of these considerations should be discussed during the selection process of your third-party supplier, put in contracts or procedures, and again, audited to ensure effectiveness and compliance on a routine basis. The next slide for inventory management consideration. Well, first question is, who owns the inventory? Legal title to the inventory. Who purchases? This is everything that's on order or in process or in the warehouse. How about long lead time items that are on order? There's a lot of suppliers out there, depending on the demand, that they actually might have 15 to 26 week lead time for certain components, which means if you're only forecasting out for your supplier to build, 60 days worth or 3 weeks worth, what do they do with these long lead time items? Well, that's a communication that both of you need to have and agree upon how much they're going to carry on order and how much of that is canceled. What ability do you have to cancel the amount in the pipeline? And where do you lose your place with the tier 2 supplier? So these are, again, things that you need to worry about. Who selects the suppliers of the components and manages the approved supplier list? Is that something that you do and that you just dictate to them who they buy? Or how is that changed? I would think that if you're going to hire a supplier to do your box build, they're going to have very good relationships with those component suppliers so that those tier 2 suppliers will let them know when a particular component needs to be changed or there's been a part that needs to be picked up from another supplier. So if that's the case, who validates the replacement? Well, if you're the owner of the functional part of the design, you would want to make sure that you're in that loop, somebody in your company. Who manages shelf life? I would think that the supplier manages the shelf life, but then again, it's important to make sure that you've called that out as a requirement. And what about end-of-life strategy at a component level? And that's again, something that you have to manage together. You don't want your supplier to be buying too many components and then they sit on the shelf and they don't work after 1 year. Who's liable for the inventory on order if you end game your product? So let's say marketing is saying, hey, we're going to end game this product because we got a new, better product coming. So you need to be working with the supplier on that. And those are things that need to be considered when you're doing outsourcing. What processes are in place to adhere inventory accuracy? Well, some companies do cycle counting. How often do they do that? How do they pick which components to do cycle counting on? And do they hit or target all of the components at least once a year? Or do they do a shutdown of everything and do a full inventory then? Again, those are considerations that you need to be aware of because it might have an interruption in your demand. And if they find a mistake on the inventory accuracy, what's done to reconcile those mistakes? What ERP or enterprise resource planning system is used to manage inventory? And one of the key considerations on that is not just inventory accuracy, but master data. What master data do they have? Controls do they have? And what are the controls in place to ensure data quality? A lot to handle on inventory management. And the next consideration is logistics. And logistics is more than just what carrier are they going to use to ship product in trucks or trains or ocean. This is about discussing the considerations of who's going to do what. Is the product going to be drop shipped from the third-party manufacturer that you're going to hire directly to your customer? Or are you're going to outsource the build, but they send it to you to ship to the customer? If they're going to be shipping to the customer, what is the proximity that you want the supplier to be to your customer? Because you might want to pick a third party that has a footprint of facilities in a regional or multi-regionals around the world. Another consideration under logistics is, well, who pays for product that's going to the customer? What if the customer needs product repairs or it was defective? If it was defective and it's being returned to the third party, do they pay for the shipping because the defect was generated by them? But what if the repair is due to the customer doing something that causes the repair? Does the customer pay? And if it's routine preventative maintenance, who pays for that? These are all, again, considerations that need to be done. If there is a replacement sent to the customer that they can continue using a product while they're waiting for their repair or preventive maintenance, who manages that pool of replacement or subsidized units while they're being, and then making sure that they come back, because that's a lot of assets. Those would be your assets that are being managed by this supplier. Another is, what is the approved packaging material for final products and for components? Because it's possible that you might have your customers have the ability to replace certain external components. So the packaging is important not just to protect against damage, but things like static discharge, contamination, refrigeration, too hot, too cold. What about import-export? Here's another area that the product or component crossing any borders, they need to have proper labeling, and that labeling needs to be approved by multiple people within, because you'll have marketing information, you're going to have product information, and there's labeling on the individual products, but the label that goes on the box, which is what your import-export customs would see, that label too has to be reviewed by both companies. And a question is, well, who's the legal owner and who approves those labels? Because if you're the legal owner and material gets stuck in quarantine at a border, are they going to be calling you, or do you want them to call the supplier, your third-party supplier? So you're looking for who's the authorized agent to address any issues at the border. And those are some of the things around logistics. Moving on now to the next consideration, have you identified with your supplier what records need to be kept? There are records throughout any process. You've got inventory control, as in transactions, receiving product, shipping product. Those are all inventory controls. You have critical process steps, test results, repair history, traceability. Again, those are different transactions that need to be kept as records, or maybe they don't. Who stores the records? Are they being stored at the supplier site in paper? Are they in file cabinets that are fireproofed, or are they scanned or transacted in a system and the system is backed up? What about record retrieval time? if the supplier says to you, we do a record retrieval within 72 hours, but you have, for certain complaints, you have to respond to regulatory agencies around the world, sometimes within 24 hours. So again, it's a consideration to look at what is their policy versus what do you need. Record retention is also an area, is usually defined by the type of record. So again, these are considerations to look to see how long, if they have a policy that they keep purchase orders for 1 year and they're automatically flushed out of the system, but you have a requirement that says the purchase order needs to be kept for 2 years or the life of the product, then you have to reconcile that and then verify that they actually are doing it, or come up with a different way that when they dump them at the end of their year, they're saved to a different place. So the record retention needs to be by type of document. Security access and backup for records. Again, who has access to the records? You don't want them exposed to people who shouldn't have them. And at the same time, you need to make sure that you can get at them when you do. Communication builds trust, and trust creates collaborative relationships where both companies are working together to achieve positive results. So the next consideration makes complete sense, that you have to address communication. Communication started during the assessment of the supplier's capabilities and then through the contract negotiations. Communication occurred on such topics like role definitions, who's going to be responsible for what, and then also defining some of the terms and conditions so that you understand you might be working with a company that has different languages around the world, so you want to make sure that some terms and conditions are very clear. Performance expectations need to be communicated. What's the frequency that, of certain communications? What is the expectation there? What about escalation process? Both for what does the supplier do within your company and what do you do in the supplier's company? And performance metrics. Well, what is the exact metric? And then how is it calculated? And what's the data source for that calculation so that they know where to get it? And how frequently are they? Is it real-time data? Or is it something that that they do on a weekly or monthly basis? Because sometimes if it's too far out, that won't tell you real time how to correct problems, and you could have a problem for a month and not even know about it. And improvement opportunities. It's critical to have regular communication to allow for course corrections along the way so that the supplier can consistently deliver. The suppliers need the freedom to discuss all other requirements and establish better understanding and potentially to provide improvement ideas. Your company hires a supplier because they're the experts. It's important to make sure that the communication is two-way because you need to listen to them. So the next consideration is improvement. You should expect your third-party supplier to have a culture of continuous improvement. What does the company do to ensure constant improvements? Do they have maturity models that with plans to reach higher levels? Do they use Six Sigma or lean methodology to eliminate non-value added steps or reducing variation on a regular basis? What's the approval process for making changes? When a lot of companies start using improvement, they don't think about in that process, well, wait a minute, we need to check and see, do we need to get authority from the customer on implementing a process change? Are practices applied across their business? So if they're doing a continuous improvement or a Kaizen event on one particular process and it's very similar to others, do they go ahead and make sure that this process is executed or implemented across the board? And maybe they had one customer that validated the change, but they didn't call you because they thought it was a very similar. Very important that you clarify any changes to your process have to be approved by you. How do both companies ensure that repair data is cycled back to design? This is really important because you want to make sure that that products are improved overall real time, what's in the factory, but you don't want the same mistakes to happen in the next generation of design. And you need to look at, well, who's responsible to make sure that that loop is closed? Ultimately, the goal is to increase customer satisfaction over the life of the business. So moving on now, last but certainly not least, is to service. Who handles customer complaints? Are you going to handle the customer complaints, or are you outsourcing that process as well? If you're going to outsource that with your box build or repairs to the supplier, it's really important to make sure that not only are they trained on how to talk to your customers, but what's the sequence of events and what should they disclose and not disclose. So a lot of training goes into that module. And are there any requirements around notifications, meaning that a certain type of failure, you might need to have that reported to you within 24 hours. But if it's something like they shipped the wrong product to the customer, and maybe that doesn't need to be reported to you other than on trends. So things to consider under that. What are the lead times the customer should expect for product returns? And again, these are service levels on response time to them, as well as what about response time from the supplier to your customer? And what about if the supplier has a request into you? What's your turn time? Because sometimes a supplier can be waiting for a response from you, which is causing a delay to the customer getting their product back. So it's really important that that's why the escalation and alternate paths. Will the supplier have multiple sites to do repairs? And if so, how do they coordinate any trends to make sure that you're looking at product that is occurring around the world? And that facilitates your customer base regionally and globally. What level is the supplier authorized to repair? We talked earlier, or I shared earlier, about there are some sub-assemblies that they don't, once they're found effective, they can't be rebuilt. So they would be discarded. However, we want to make sure that there's some way of looking at the diagnostics. So they might be taken apart, but who does that diagnostics? Is the supplier going to do that? Or are they going to send any discarded parts to you for the further diagnostics? Are you being a good customer to your supplier to enable them to deliver is a question. Well, how well have you defined what is required from the supplier? Audits are a risk management tool and should uncover how well the supplier relationship is forming. What systematic problems need to be addressed to ensure compliance and improvement for both companies? So when we move to the next slide, we're talking about audit planning. The audit planning from each of the considerations that we just talked about is documented somewhere. It's either in supplier contracts, purchase orders, procedures, engineering specifications, scientists' formulas, quality agreements, master agreements, business plans, annual reports from a financial perspective. You can create audit plans, good audit checklists, audit agendas, audit schedules, interview questions, as well as understand which people and departments to meet with at the supplier based on the considerations that we've talked about. The outputs of each of these considerations also determine what are the records, what are the reports. Seek them out as well to create a more informed audit plan. So let's move to the next slide and recap for now. Knowing why a company would outsource their manufacturing or business processes and understanding all the considerations examined when making that decision. This helps you execute an effective audit. Better audit planning will generate a more useful third-party supplier audit and create a better relationship with suppliers by not only showing that you've respected their time, you've respected their resources by also executing a thorough audit because the tool is not just for your company, it's also for their company. An audit that provokes a more valuable audit report, which should reflect systemic issues and good practices leading to improved performance. Audits are conducted to ensure compliance and improved performance, resulting in increased customer satisfaction, increased profits, and shareholder value for both companies. I hope this has been helpful for you. I thank you very much.